Hello again. Marx's public forum topic is resolved North Korea poses a more serious threat to United States national security than Iran. My apologies for picking this up a couple weeks after the start of March. The tournaments I have been to for the past couple weekends, states, qualifiers, have still been using the WikiLeaks topic. So this is our first week starting this topic. Hopefully you guys aren't too far ahead of me by now. But here are some observations on this topic and some ways that people can adapt to this to hopefully improve their record in this debate. So, first thing is, while this topic is worded very similarly to the WikiLeaks topic, it is a much more balanced topic. It offers two very similar, very analogous countries, and the rhetoric doesn't necessarily favor one side over the other. Again, both countries have a lot in common. Both countries can easily be compared to each other. So while there certainly are differences between the two, there's plenty of common ground that allows for good comparative analysis by smart teams. Anyhow, arguments about threat construction are nowhere near as viable as on the prior topic because both sides are being asked what the greater threat is. Neither side is necessarily constructing a threat, but is asking if these are threats, which one is more serious. So I don't think any arguments about stigmatization, labeling things as threats, calling things threats of censorship, etc., have nearly as much traction as they did on the WikiLeaks topics. That said, the definition of U.S. national security, what actually counts as that, can still vary, much like it did in February's topic, primarily because the different countries threaten different things. So if something does or doesn't count as our national security, that definition debate can actually be worthwhile for a team to engage in as long as it's not a substitute for actual argumentation. Much more so than many other topics, this one is going to require teams to engage directly on the other side's point. Teams who have experience with flex casing, teams who can use the extra time at the end of their constructive or rebuttal, will find themselves pulling ahead of teams who are used to just sticking to their individual talking points because of how much the arguments here interact with each other. Just to give you a basic idea of what I mean here. The idea here is that we're comparing a country with a somewhat unstable dictator who hangs on the power through messianic rhetoric, a history of anti-U.S. sentiment and a Cold War mentality, a NASA nuclear program of unknown progress that suffered recent setbacks, a risk of regional conflict that's mainly against a nearby U.S.-dependent ally, major power that sides with it against the USA, a network of connections to terrorist groups, a massive U.S. military buildup near its border, a large military for its size that's partly enabled by a regional hegemon, a history of failed negotiations, in particular with the UN, and secret police forces cracking down on current protests going on there, with a second country that also meets all of these criteria. Nearly any point you can think of for one of the two countries applies to the other to some extent also. If I want to talk about proliferation, there's going to be ways that both countries have that's analogous. If I want to talk about connections to terrorist groups, again, there are ways that I can draw analogies between either one, so I can draw parallels between both. And the debate doesn't come down to which country encourages terrorism. It comes down to which team is better at explaining how the way one country does is a greater threat than the way the other country does. That said, there is a little bit of a challenge to researching this topic because there's tons of literature out there on either country, but it's all either very myopic or very one-sided. And what I mean by that is there's lots of stuff saying North Korea is scary or North Korea is safe, and tons of stuff saying Iran is scary or Iran is safe. But there's very little that actually compares the two to each other. The only real reason to evaluate which is the greater threat, rather than the individual threat either poses or whether either is a threat, is if you would need to allocate resources to deal with, to confront one of the two threats. So anything about that is really not available to the general public. You will have to extrapolate on your own. This means that it's going to be important to be able to spin evidence, and less important to just find that one crucial card. Every card is going to take some kind of spin to actually make it adapt to a comparative topic, because very little is actually going to say, but this is why Iran is a greater threat than North Korea. The majority of that stuff is either outdated or proprietary. Anyhow, just going to look at some of these individual aspects in a little more detail and talk about how they're different between the two countries. Terrorism, for instance. Both countries have been accused of having connections to terrorist groups. Both countries aren't suspected of actually launching some kind of weapon of mass destruction themselves, so much as giving it to somebody else and keeping their own hands clean. Iran is obviously on the U.S. list of state sponsors of terrorism because of Hezbollah, because of other actions in the Middle East. North Korea is no longer on that list. That was a concession made during one of the talks with the U.S. That said, that doesn't really mean much of anything because our list of state sponsors of terrorism is extremely political. Cuba is still on it and has been since the 80s, despite the fact that pretty much any impartial report hasn't found them having any connections to any terrorist groups whatsoever. Saudi Arabia, you would think having the majority of 9/11 hijackers would earn you a spot on that, but apparently not. So the list is largely a political tool. It doesn't actually mean too much, but it is one way they differ. One is on the list, one is not. Also, Iran shares more of an ideological connection to terrorist groups it is accused of consorting with. North Korea, it's more a question of practicality. Aside from that, proliferation, like I said, both countries have suffered fairly major recent setbacks. North Korea had to destroy the Yongbyon reactor as a part of an agreement. Iran had its facilities crippled to an unknown extent by the Stuxnet worm. Between those two, the question is which has suffered a bigger setback and which can recover more. Overall, Iran is far and away the more technological society and has more foreign aid to draw on. But at the same time, North Korea has more material and has been able to work unobstructed for a little bit longer. As far as regional allies go, the U.S. has close ties with Israel and South Korea, both of whom see their respective neighbors as a large threat and urge the U.S. to take a harder line against them. Generally speaking, South Korea tends to be more of a sit-there-and-take-it mentality, while Israel tends to be more proactive as far as its dealings with Iran. Israel talks about preemptive strikes against Iran. Odds that South Korea would move against North Korea without the U.S.'s knowledge or consent are substantially smaller. That said, all of these things could be shaken up by other international events. There are no hard and fast guarantees here, but generally speaking, Israel is considered to be a little bit more of an unstable ally as far as the two goes, as far as its capacity to act unilaterally. But beyond that, there's also the fact that South Korea has less options if something should arise. South Korea is not a nuclear power in its own right in the same way that Israel is. Both countries have an underlying philosophy which either is directly religious or borders on religious. Iran is different ethnically and religiously from the majority of the Middle East. Persian instead of Arab, Shia instead of Sunni Islam. North Korea has philosophy all of its own. Even during the Cold War, its particular flavor of communism is different. These days, the philosophy it espouses is called Juche, but that's not necessarily the philosophy that the government actually subscribes to. There's a lot of literature talking about how that's more just propaganda designed to explain away their philosophy to foreign observers. Both have a leader who is largely without question. The comparison here really isn't between Ahmadinejad and Kim Jong-il, it's between the supreme leader and Kim Jong-il, whose title is exactly what it sounds like. Saying Ahmadinejad speaks for Iran is kind of like saying the ambassador for North Korea speaks for North Korea. While they may do so in a purely nominal way, if it comes down to a clash of wills, each country has one leader who is supreme. And neither of those two leaders thinks particularly highly of the United States. Anti-US sentiment is very high in both countries, especially over the past decade, but for slightly different reasons, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. Also, both countries have ties with Russia and China. In each case, one country honestly supports them, one country just wants to see the U.S.'s power diminished, which is trades back and forth between the two. North Korea has closer ties with China, but Russia is involved in six-party talks, and while it will not overtly back North Korea, doesn't want the U.S. having too much leverage over them. Similarly, it's the other way around with Iran, where Russia is trying to be involved in Iran's nuclear program, and China is just occasionally keeping its hand in the game for the purposes of regional hegemony. Aside from that, there's really two ways to win a debate on this topic. The first of which is to control the internal links on the mutual scenarios. Explain why your country is more likely than their country to proliferate. Explain why your country is more likely to miscalculate. explain why your country's connections to anti-U.S. groups are more deleterious, more prevalent, more likely to actually manifest in some kind of actual tangible threat in their countries. The other thing that you can do, aside from that, is to try and find something unique about the country that doesn't actually apply to the other. For instance, Iran is much more connected to the outside world. On the one hand, this makes it more technological. On the other hand, it also means that it has moderating influences because of foreign media, because people are better informed, because they are allowed access to things originating from outside of Iran. Another difference might be that North Korea sees the U.S. as enemy number one, and South Korea as just a misguided country that should be a part of it. Iran, on the other hand, probably sees the U.S. as public enemy number 3 after Britain and Israel, according to the majority of Iranian politicians. Religious connections could be another tiebreaker. Another thing that's unique about them, as could North Korea's dependence on aid from other countries, including the U.S., which Iran really doesn't have. So again, the two things you can do on this topic are to better control the internal links without actually using debate jargon, without saying, I better control the probabilistic impacts. Here, I do a better job of explaining why there's only a risk of offense here. You don't want to actually do that on this topic. It's a really easy trap to fall into, especially with the preponderance of overlapping policy literature. What you want to do instead is just be able to explain that all in layman's terms. Look, both of us say that there's a risk of this country sponsoring terrorism, but here's why it is more likely to arise from our country than theirs. And again, it requires you to know both sides of the debate fairly well, able to explain it fluently without lapsing into jargon. The second way is to find something unique about the country that only you control and catches the other team by surprise. The second way is going to be very effective early in the month, but by the time we get towards 1st April, we're going to be in a situation where debaters are going to have to know how their argument works on both sides of the resolution, not just why is this a reason we're a threat, but why is this a reason that the other country, even though it has something kind of like this, isn't as much of a threat. And it's going to have to be done, in many cases, without a direct base of comparative literature, but instead with making comparisons yourself, with spinning literature, with using your research background, your knowledge of the topic, to actually explain this is why this country's threat is more serious, and this country's threat is just negligible. That's about all I've got on this topic. If you have specific questions, by all means send me an email, post a comment, do whatever. I will get back to you on them. Another video should be coming before too long on April's Organ Donation topic for NDCAs and TOC. Hope to hear from everybody soon. Good luck. Enjoy debating the topic.